So there was this family, the Rodriguezes. They were moving from Ohio to California. See, the dad had a change in jobs, and so that was the only option they had. The family was super sad. They were going to miss their friends. They were going to miss family that lived close by. But most of all, they were going to miss their church family. They were super involved in their church. The kids were active in their youth group. And they were just sad. But they were also excited about what California brings. California brings the beach, brings mountains. It's not just flat land like Ohio. So they were kind of excited about that as well. And then the day arrived, the day that they had to move. They gathered as a family in the front room. The front room had this big picture window that kind of overlooked the lawn and kind of had a nice view. And they looked outside and they saw this SUV that they'd had that their dad kind of just bought, and it was overloaded. It had everything that they could possibly pack in this SUV was packed in it. And they sat there waiting for the moving truck. And the dad called everybody together and said, "I feel like we need to pray." So they all gathered around and just started to pray about the changes in their life. Pray about why God brought upon these changes and what the changes were going to look like. And when they all got done praying, they sat there and talked about what God had said to them. And all of them felt like they really needed to listen to God when they got to their new house. Because if they did, that God was promising them dramatic changes in their lives and in the lives of the people that they were going to meet. So armed with that excitement, they hopped in the SUV and they began the 2,400-mile drive from Ohio to California. Brother and sister sat in the back seat, fighting most of the way. Finally, the parents gave in and threw their iPads at them and said, "Just play with these. Stop arguing." Mom and Dad finally had some hours of peace. And then they arrived. They arrived in California. And on the way, they had seen the beach, and they had seen the mountains, and they drove through Hollywood and were frightened. But then they got to their suburb, and they turned down the street, and it was kind of like out of a movie. The houses were all really well taken care of. They weren't giant houses. It was kind of a middle-class, average neighborhood, but the houses were really, really well taken care of. And the dad could hear the kids in the back seat kind of go, "Whoa." And he kind of puffed his chest up because he's kind of the one that chose this neighborhood. That's where his work kind of said, "Well, here's some neighborhoods." And the dad said, "This is it." So Dad kind of took it. And the lawns were just meticulously well maintained. There was all these like oak trees in the front yard. It was just a really nice looking street. And as they drove up the street, they saw people outside. Oh, excuse me. They saw people. Jeez, I'm getting choked up already. They saw people outside on their lawns. They saw people on their porches. And as they pulled into their driveway, they saw the person directly next to them, saw them kind of turning into the driveway and just gave them a wave and a smile. And they waved back and smiled. And the guy 2 doors down was taking care of his lawn. He was like mowing his lawn, and he would stop every once in a while and get down. Looks like he's picking weeds. But the lawn was absolutely perfect. Like you couldn't tell where he had mowed and where he hadn't mowed because the lawn was so perfect. And they pulled in and they began to unload everything. And the person across the street said, "How you doing?" They said, "Hi, good, yes, long drive." Anyways, they got in the house. And the first thing they did, Dad said, "Hey, we need to pray again." They all gathered around and they prayed for the new house. And they said, "God, this is your house. Do what you want with it." So they began unpacking. And the next morning, the mom said, "I kind of feel like we need to bake some cookies." And the kids are all, "Yeah, I do too." And they said, "But we need to take these cookies and kind of walk around the neighborhood and just introduce ourselves and get to know some people. And it's always easier to do when you have something to give them." And the kids are all, "Oh, okay." Because they knew that meant that they were going to have to help their mom make these cookies. So Mom unpacked all the cookie pans, and much to her dismay, she couldn't go from scratch because not everything was unpacked. So she had to go and buy some boxes of cookie mix. But she bought plenty. And they started baking and baking and baking. Now, Mom was very creative. She had these fancy little cellophane wrap things, and she'd put like 2 cookies in each one and tie it with a thing and just said, "Well, I wish I had a little name tag I could put on there, but I'm still getting organized. It's okay. We'll just do this." So they come down with their big basket of cookies, and they start walking up and down the street, knocking on doors. Some people actually opened the doors and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And were very friendly to them and said, "Great, welcome to the neighborhood. We're glad you're here." Some people, you see, peeked through the window and then closed the curtain and said, "I don't know who you are. I don't want to talk to you. You're probably going to try to convert me to some religion." Some people opened the doors and were like, "Okay, great, yeah, thank you," and just walked away. But they weren't discouraged. They knew that this is what God wanted them to do. So they walked up and down that neighborhood, and they took hours handing out these cookies until every single cookie was handed out. Now, the kids were not super happy that every single cookie was handed out because they'd worked super hard and didn't get to eat any of the cookies. But they were all gone. But the reward they got from that was amazing. People came over the very next day and said, "Hey, thanks for those cookies. My name is so-and-so. I'm just really glad that you're here." They said, "Thank you. We're glad you're here. We're glad to be here. We're glad to meet you." And they began building relationships with everybody on their streets. They would start having barbecues. Big old barbecues in the backyard, and originally only like 2 or 3 people from the neighborhood would come. Before you knew it, everybody on the street was in their backyard on a Saturday, just having these massive barbecues. And the one thing they always did before they ate, they were sure they prayed. See, they were not ashamed of their faith. That's what drove them. That's what defined them. And they let everybody in the neighborhood know. Not in a pushy way like, "We're better than you," but in a way that showed, "This is why I love you. Because Jesus loves me." So within a few months, relationships were growing really, really strong. And the guy next door, or 2 doors down, that was mowing the already perfect lawn, his name was Joe, and they got to be pretty good friends with Joe. And they would always say, "Joe, how do you keep your yard so perfect?" He said, "It's just something I enjoy doing." They said, it's absolutely beautiful." And he said, "Oh, thank you." Well, as they got to know Joe a little bit better, it came out as they sat and talked that Joe actually 6 months earlier had been battling alcoholism and had lost his job because of it. And that's why he was outside so often mowing his lawn. Because that was the one thing that he could do that would take his mind away from the fact that he was about 3 months away from losing his house, that he was struggling to feed his family. His savings was getting very, very thin. And he was scared. He didn't know what he was going to do. He could not find a job, no matter what he did. So they came to Joe and they prayed. And they prayed. And they prayed. They laid hands on Joe. And Joe wasn't a Christian, so I thought it was a little bit weird. But he said, whatever, I'll do whatever it takes at this point. Within a week, because Joe was willing to admit his weakness and admit the struggles that he was going through, somebody in the neighborhood said, oh, Joe, my company's had an opening for weeks and we can't find the right guy. You'd fit in perfect there. He had a job. Joe started to think, wonder if this has anything to do with all that praying. Nah, sorry. The people next door, the ones that waved as they drove up, they knew they had a daughter, but they'd never really seen her. They'd seen her like in the car driving away, but she was never outside playing, or they didn't really know what was going on. And they were never invited over to their house until this one afternoon. The whole family was invited to go over. They walked into the house and they saw an oxygen tank in there. And they saw a girl that looked to be about 8 or 9. Turns out she was 13. She was laying in a bed with one of those nasal cannula things that provide oxygen. No hair. Skinny as a rail. And she had had cancer. She has cancer. And the parents began to share that the treatment was working. The girl was getting better. But they were super scared because the insurance wasn't covering everything. It covered a portion of all the treatments, but they were getting deeper and deeper and deeper in debt and felt like they weren't going to be able to continue on with the process. Because if you get to a certain point where you get too far behind, they were worried that the specialized hospital that they were going to was going to kick them out and they were going to have to go to another hospital where she couldn't get the same kind of treatment. So they prayed for her. Now this family was a Christian family, but their faith had been torn and ripped. And instead of laying on Jesus and leaning towards him, they pushed him away. But they prayed for this little girl and prayed and prayed. Then when they got home, the dad said, God said something to me. God said that my pride and joy, my brand new SUV, the one that was overloaded, that took him from Ohio to California safely, his very first new car, needed to go. See, they didn't have any extra money. They had enough to get by, but with the move and the new job, there wasn't extra money, but there was an extra car. They had 2 cars, and the wife wasn't working. So, as a family, they went out and they washed the SUV, got it all nice and prettied up, and put a sign on it. Within 2 days, the SUV was sold. They were able to hand the family $52,000. That got that family completely caught up. They were starting back at zero. That family saw God move in a powerful way that night. Because of these sacrifices, and because of the prayer, because of their faithfulness, this neighborhood was starting to be transformed. People on the street that never knew each other, never talked before, were talking to each other. We're spending time together. We're getting to know each other. Then the Rodriguezes realized that they needed to start a Bible study. So they started one in their house. And the first night, they had about 10 people there, and Mom got to make her from-scratch cookies, and they were awesome, and the kids got to eat a couple this time. And they started a study for new believers because there weren't a lot of Christians in the family or in the neighborhood. And as time went on, that Bible study grew. And within 2 months, they couldn't fit everybody in the house. So they went to the church, the pastor at the church they had found, and they said, "We started this Bible study, and it's too huge. My little house can't hold it, and nobody's house in the neighborhood can hold it. Is there any room at the church?" And the pastor said, "Of course, have it here." So they started having it at the church. And by having it at the church, people started going to that church because they were familiar with it. Within 1 year, that Bible study grew so big that it split into 2 Bible studies. And Joe led the second Bible study. Within 2 years, there were 3 of them. See, this is all because a family got together and prayed and asked God what to do. They listened and they built relationships, and they changed their lives and everybody else's lives. This is what we do here. This is an example of what happens and why we're here at Exit 83. We're here to have fun and we have a great time. But our goal is to provide a safe place where people can love Jesus and people can get to know Jesus. Is this in Acts 2, 42 through 45, well, it actually goes through 47. It gives us an example of what the early church was like. It says, all the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and to the sharing of meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. A deep sense of awe came over them all. The apostles performed many miracles, many miraculous signs and wonders. And all the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshiped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and prosperity, or generosity, all while praising God, enjoying the goodwill of all the people. And each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. If you guys look at our little Detour Group sign here, if you look down on the bottom right corner over here, those are the verses that we use for Detour Groups, to describe Detour Groups. And the reason we do that is because this describes how the church began. And it began through relationships. It began through people sacrificing, loving each other, and bringing each other to Christ. And that's our goal with Detour Groups. We want it to be a place where you can bring people who don't know Jesus and feel comfortable. Just like Joe felt comfortable to tell them his secret. We want it to be a place where lives are changed. So tonight we're going to break up into our Detour Groups. And we're going to have a little bit of time to just get to know each other and come up with what God is telling us about how we should run our Detour Groups. Because every group is very unique and very different. So we're going to spend some time in prayer. We're going to spend some time talking. So, let's go.